All right, so you've got this new assignment coming up, and it sounds like we're talking some pretty serious military strategy stuff.
Hmm.
We're diving into Carl von Clausewitz today, On War. That book's like the classic, right?
It really is.
But we're not just doing an overview, we're getting into the weeds with Chapter 11, the one where he really breaks down the role of battles.
Yeah, Clausewitz, he really gets into the why of battles,
Yeah.
why they happen, what their purpose is, what they're supposed to achieve. It's fascinating stuff.
And this is coming from a guy who saw a lot of action himself, right? 19th century warfare, right in the thick of the Napoleonic Wars, he knew what he was talking about.
Oh, absolutely. He wasn't just some armchair theorist. He experienced firsthand the chaos and brutality of war, and that really comes through in his writing.
So when he talks about the goal of war being to destroy the enemy's army, I mean, that's pretty direct.
No mincing words with Clausewitz. And for his time, that was a pretty radical idea. You have to understand, back then, wars could drag on for years and years with all this maneuvering and posturing, but Clausewitz was basically saying, look, the point isn't just to have a war, it's to win it decisively.
And for him, that all came down to the big battle.
Exactly, that decisive clash, not just skirmishes or minor engagements. He's talking about the kind of massive confrontation where the fate of nations hangs in the balance. Think of it like the focal point of the whole conflict, where all the energy, all the resources, all the strategic thinking comes to a head.
That's intense. I mean, it makes sense when you think about the scale of warfare back then. Huge armies clashing in these epic battles. But today, things are different, right? We've got cyber warfare, drone strikes, special ops. Those big decisive battles, they don't seem as common anymore.
You're right. The nature of warfare has definitely evolved. But here's the thing about Clausewitz. Even though he was writing in the context of 19th century warfare, the principles he laid out, they still resonate today in some really surprising ways.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, think about it. Even in cyber warfare, you're still aiming to achieve some form of decisive advantage, right? You might not have armies lined up on a battlefield, but you're still trying to cripple your enemy's ability to wage war, whether that's by disrupting their communications, taking down their infrastructure, or just sowing chaos and confusion.
So even though the tools are different, that core idea of a decisive blow, a game-changing strike, it's still relevant.
Absolutely. Clausewitz was way ahead of his time in that sense. He understood that warfare is ultimately about imposing your will on the enemy, about breaking their ability to resist. And that's true whether you're fighting with muskets and cannons or ones and zeros.
And he recognized the huge psychological impact of those big battles too, right? I mean, imagine the pressure on those commanders, knowing that one decision could decide the fate of their nation.
Oh, absolutely. Clausewitz talks about that a lot, the mental strain, the weight of responsibility that comes with leading men into battle, especially when the stakes are so high. And he wasn't afraid to acknowledge that some leaders might shy away from that kind of responsibility, might try to avoid those decisive confrontations altogether.
Hoping for a bloodless victory, maybe.
Exactly. But Clausewitz argues that more often than not, that kind of thinking is wishful thinking. He says that trying to avoid those decisive battles, clinging to the hope of a bloodless victory, can actually be more dangerous in the long run. It's like postponing the inevitable, You're just letting the conflict drag on, letting the tensions build, and that can have its own consequences.
Yeah, it's like delaying the hard choices doesn't make them go away. If anything, it might even make them tougher down the line.
Exactly. And Clausewitz makes this really interesting point. He says that sometimes trying to avoid bloodshed altogether can actually lead to more suffering in the long run. It's counterintuitive, but it makes you think.
It does. So he's not just advocating for reckless aggression here, is he? There's more to it than just charging into battle.
Oh, absolutely not. Clausewitz was all about calculated, decisive action. He uses this really vivid image. He compares the main battle to a focal point, just like when you use a magnifying glass to focus the sun's rays.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
It's about concentrating your forces, your resources, your efforts for maximum impact. And this makes a lot of sense when you consider the kind of warfare he was dealing with. Huge armies, limited communication.
Yeah, not a whole lot of surgical strikes back then.
Right. So this idea of a decisive battle, it was about cutting through all that complexity, delivering a blow that would tip the scales decisively. And to illustrate this, he points to some pretty prominent examples like Napoleon.
Ah, Napoleon, the masters of the decisive battle, right. But what makes him such a good example for Clausewitz?
Well, Clausewitz actually uses Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Ulm in 1805.
Oh, yeah, that was a quick one.
It was lightning fast, and Clausewitz uses it as a prime example of a decisive victory. It was this brilliant campaign, a masterpiece of maneuver and timing where Napoleon completely outmaneuvered the Austrian army.
And that was Napoleon's genius, wasn't it?
Yeah,
He wasn't afraid to be bold, to take risks to achieve those decisive victories.
exactly. And Clausewitz highlights how that boldness, that willingness to seek the decisive battle was often the key to Napoleon's success. But it's not just about being aggressive for the sake of it. He's very clear about that. Clausewitz emphasizes that there's a lot more to it than just throwing troops at the enemy and hoping for the best. There's a strategic element here that's absolutely crucial.
So what makes a victory truly decisive, according to Clausewitz? What are the ingredients?
He lays out 4 key aspects that determine how impactful a victory is. Let's see. There's the tactical setup of the battle, the terrain, the balance of forces, particularly cavalry, and the relative strengths of the armies involved. He argues that each of these plays a critical role in shaping the outcome of the battle.
Okay, let's break those down a bit because there's a lot to unpack there. First up, tactical setup. What does he mean by that?
Essentially, it's about how each army positions itself on the battlefield, how they maneuver, how they exploit the terrain, how they leverage their strengths against the enemy's weaknesses. It's about using your forces effectively to create advantages. Think about it. A well-executed flanking maneuver, for example, is going to be far more decisive than 2 armies just lining up opposite each other and charging.
Right, it's about strategy, about using surprise and maneuver to maximize your impact. So it's not just about the size of your army, it's about how you use it.
Precisely. And then we have the terrain. Now, that one might seem fairly obvious.
I mean, fighting in the mountains is going to be a lot different from fighting on open plains, right?
Exactly. And Clausewitz understood this perfectly. He pointed out that battles fought in difficult terrain like hills, forests, mountains, they often resulted in smaller, less decisive victories.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's harder to maneuver large forces to bring your full might to bear when the landscape itself is working against you.
Exactly. Now, the next factor, the balance of forces, particularly cavalry, that one might seem a bit more specific to Clausewitz's time.
Yeah, the days of cavalry charges are kind of over, aren't they?
Well, yes and no. The role of cavalry has obviously changed significantly since the 19th century, but the underlying principle that Clausewitz is getting at is still relevant. See, back then, cavalry represented this mobile, hard-hitting force that could exploit a breakthrough, chase down a routed enemy, really press the advantage after a victory.
So it's not just about winning the battle, it's about having the forces in place to exploit that win, to really turn it into a decisive victory.
Exactly. It's about turning a tactical victory into a strategic one. And that brings us to the last factor. He talks about the relative strengths of the armies involved. And again, it's not just about numbers here.
Right, it's about more than just who has the bigger battalions.
Exactly. Clausewitz was adamant about this. He argued that factors like morale, training, discipline, leadership, these things play a huge role in determining the outcome of a battle. A smaller, well-trained force with high morale can often defeat a larger, less disciplined opponent.
So quality over quantity, in a way.
Absolutely. And this is where the role of leadership becomes absolutely paramount. Clausewitz was a firm believer that a skilled commander, someone who could inspire their troops, make sound decisions under pressure, and seize opportunities as they arose, could make all the difference in the heat of battle.
So even with the best tactical setup, a favorable balance of forces, it can still all come down to the person calling the shots.
That's right. He argued that while military theory and strategic planning are obviously important, there are certain qualities that you just can't learn from a textbook.
That gut instinct.
Exactly. That intuition, that ability to size up a situation in a split second and make the right call. Clausewitz called it coup d'oeil, which is French for, well, literally stroke of the eye.
Like that flash of insight, that ability to see the chessboard, to anticipate the enemy's moves and respond accordingly.
Precisely. And he believed that this coup d'oeil, this decisiveness under pressure, was absolutely essential for any successful military leader.
It's like having that sixth sense on the battlefield, right? Being able to sense those subtle shifts in momentum, those fleeting opportunities that can mean the difference between victory and defeat.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he really believed that this coup d'oeil, this ability to make those split-second decisions under immense pressure, it was the mark of a truly great military leader. But now you might be thinking, okay, this is all fascinating, but we're not fighting Napoleonic Wars anymore, are we?
Yeah, things have changed a bit since the 19th century.
They sure have. We've got drones, cyber warfare, AI things Clausewitz could never have even imagined. But here's the thing that always blows my mind. Even though the tools of warfare have evolved, even though the battlefields themselves look completely different, those core principles that Clausewitz outlined, they're still incredibly relevant today.
So how do we connect those dots? How does this idea of decisive battles, of understanding terrain and maneuver, how does that translate to something like, say, a cyber conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Well, think about it this way. Even in a cyber conflict, you're still trying to achieve some form of decisive victory. You're trying to cripple your enemy's ability to wage war, to defend themselves.
By, like, disrupting their command and control systems
Right.
or taking down critical infrastructure.
Exactly. It's about finding those critical vulnerabilities, those points of leverage, where you can inflict the most damage and really swing the momentum of the conflict in your favor. And Clausewitz gives us a framework for thinking about those things.
So it's not just about having the latest and greatest cyber weapons or hacking tools, right? It's about understanding how to use those tools strategically, how to leverage them for maximum impact.
You got it. It's about having that strategic mindset, understanding the principles of maneuver and surprise, even in a digital domain. And that's where Clausewitz remains so insightful. He forces us to think beyond the tools themselves and to focus on the underlying principles of conflict.
It's about understanding those timeless principles that drive conflict, no matter what form it takes, what weapons are being used, or where the battle is being fought.
Exactly. And those are the kind of insights that are going to be valuable to you no matter what challenges you face in your new assignment. Clausewitz isn't just some historical figure to study in a textbook. He's offering practical wisdom that you can apply on the ground in the real world.
It's about understanding the enduring nature of conflict, the human element that underlies all wars, regardless of the technology or the specific circumstances.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, warfare is a human endeavor. And understanding the human factors, the psychological factors that Clausewitz talks about, those are just as important today as they were back in his time.
Well, on that note, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into Carl von Clausewitz and his incredible insights on the nature of war. We covered a lot of ground today, from the significance of decisive battles to the crucial role of leadership and that almost intangible coup d'oeil that can make all the difference in the heat of the moment. But the takeaway here is this knowledge is power. The more you understand these principles, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the complexities of your new assignment. Good luck out there.